Now let's talk about schizoaffective disorder, which is a particular kind of condition that is related to schizophrenia. All right. So, someone who has schizoaffective disorder meets the criteria for schizophrenia and for a mood disorder, either a major depressive or manic disorder or a combination. There are psychotic features and mood disturbances that happen at the same time, or they could appear on and off, or they could appear interchangeably. It is a longitudinal illness that can't be diagnosed during the first episode. So, what does that mean? It means that because there are mood features in schizophrenia, we need to observe a person over a long period of time to determine are they experiencing schizophrenia and they have some mood issues, or are the mood disturbances going beyond what would happen with schizophrenia and they actually qualify for them for, say, a major depressive disorder? So it's a complex diagnosis. Why is it important to differentiate? Well, the treatment for schizophrenia versus a mood disorder can be different, right? And the medications need to be compatible, and also the treatment. And of course, this can impact all ADLs and IADLs, so it can be extremely debilitating. There are periodic episodes, or sometimes they're called relapses, with schizoaffective disorder, and there's no cure for it, but symptoms can be controlled and managed. If untreated, the individual has difficulty with work and education, and there's a very heavy reliance on family and caregivers, and they may need to have supported living arrangements, just so they can so they can function, or at least not be unsafe to themselves or others. So we took a little sidestep for schizoaffective disorder. Now we're back to schizophrenia. And we don't understand it very well. So there's a number of theories about it. I will go through them one at a time and give you just some insight into what we think might be going on. This is an overview of the various potential causes. We have genetic theories, neurodevelopmental ones. There's a dopamine hypothesis, and then sort of an update to that that's happened relatively recently, and then a diathesis stress theory, and finally, there's some environmental factors that can contribute to the disorder. So first up is genetic theories. There is very strong evidence that schizophrenia is influenced by genetics. If we said if somebody first order or first generation has schizophrenia, your likelihood of having it goes up quite a bit. If in monozygotic twins, 41 to 65%. So that is huge. And that in twin studies, in autism and schizophrenia and a number of different disorders really give us a lot of information about genetic components of diagnoses and of the etiology, because they share so much genetic material. Genes, at the very least, are a predisposing factor, and it's likely caused by an interaction of genes rather than one specific gene. And more as we've mapped the human genome and figured out more information about genetics and epigenetics, we know that a lot of conditions actually have genetic components on more than one specific gene. Contrast that with something like Down syndrome, where we know that chromosome 21 has an extra leg, so the trisomy. So that's a genetic piece of things. There's also neurodevelopmental theories, and what we think is that There could be prenatal complications that later result in schizophrenia, either oxygen deprivation or potential for a virus that comes through to the fetus during gestation. And there's also developmental issues that occur, potentially that can occur during adolescence, some abnormal brain maturation, and something called hypofrontality, which is reduced blood flow, cerebral blood flow, and metabolism in the frontal lobe. And what we know is that frontal lobe is really responsible for a lot of executive functioning. This is an interesting image of a healthy control and the amount of activity that's going on versus a person with schizophrenia's brain, and notice how much lower the synaptic marker levels are. So the synapses are going off all the time, right? And when you think about it, a person with schizophrenia, especially with negative symptoms, is going to have a lot less brain activity causing those negative symptoms. So that's an example, or a visual of it, if you will. Next up is a set of 2 slides about the dopamine hypothesis. So I'll tell you about that, then I'll tell you about the update. We believe that schizophrenia likely involves an overreactivity of dopamine transmission in the brain. And how we have come to this conclusion is that when we give a person with schizophrenia a phenothiazine drug, it can reduce symptoms. So phenothiazines block dopamine function, and they therefore reduce psychotic symptoms. We also know that amphetamines cause symptoms that mimic paranoid schizophrenia in typical individuals. And again, the term paranoid schizophrenia is an old term. We use it because it's recognizable. So amphetamines are stimulants. They increase dopamine in healthy individuals, and they also cause symptoms that mimic schizophrenia. So that's our original hypothesis about dopamine. It has evolved over time, and now this dopamine hypothesis seems to be overly simplistic because newer antipsychotic medications, which we also call atypical antipsychotics, can be just as effective as older medications, which are the typical antipsychotics. So what does this tell us? It tells us that serotonin function is also affected, and that there might be a slightly less intense effect of dopamine blocking. So the chemistry of it is beyond my digging right now. If you're interested, we can certainly go there, and please feel free to bring that up, or jot down any other questions that you have, and we'll look at figuring out the answers to them. But this interplay between dopamine and serotonin is telling us that the dopamine hypothesis, while it is a workable one, is potentially not the whole story. All right, and then we have something called the diathesis stress theory. So what this says is that exposure to stress is required for individuals who already have a biological predisposition to go on to actually express the symptoms and the disorder of schizophrenia. So you combine this biological predisposition, right? So we know it runs in families. We know there's some things that increase one's risk factors, excuse me, plus stress equals potentially schizophrenia. The evidence suggests that impaired stress tolerance, or folks that are particularly sensitive to stress, have higher rates of psychosis or worsening of symptoms. And diathesis means a constitutional predisposition towards a particular state or condition, especially one that's abnormal or diseased. So when we put it together, we have this constellation of factors that could contribute to the expression of schizophrenia. And finally, we have environmental factors that may contribute. Minority status, so it's not based on race or ethnicity specifically, but the degree with which someone assumes a minority position within a culture, or the extent of feeling like an outsider. So this is it's complicated, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that people of color or people of particular ethnicities, or white people for that matter, so people of specific races or ethnicities, thank you for letting me update, are more sensitive to getting schizophrenia, but that people from racial or ethnicity groups that feel like outsiders or feel oppressed may run a higher risk. We know this because when someone feels a sense of belonging within their community, they run a lower risk of developing schizophrenia. This has some implications for treatment in terms of how do we reduce people's feeling not a part of or excluded, or some oppression or bias in their lives, right? We also know that an urban environment could be a causal factor. Again, there's this idea of being an outsider or not a part of, and the term that we use for that is greater social fragmentation. So again, not being connected, not feeling a part of, may contribute to schizophrenia. And finally, and interesting, early in and heavy use of marijuana is thought to be connected with schizophrenia, in that there's a connection between the synaptic pruning that happens in adolescence, right? So we're developing all of these connections and pathways when we're young, and then as we get into adolescence, we're pruning and refining the brain connections, the synaptic connections, and the thought goes that it makes the brain particularly vulnerable to developing schizophrenia during that time. Raises some issues about the safety of marijuana and how that would interface with the legality of marijuana. I'm not taking a stand on it in any way, shape, or form, but it does bring up an interesting potential health issue. All right, so next up is treatment.